I'm so pleased to welcome you this evening. My name is Maida Roth, and I'm Director of Development here at Rodef Shalom Congregation. I'm pleased to let you know that we are so honored to have Barbara Jones and Dr. Larry Glascoe with us tonight. They are the experts on Sam Rosenberg, and I'm assuming that you all know who he is. By the end of the evening, you'll be even better friends with him. Barbara Jones was the first curator and is now the Curator Emerita of the Westmoreland Museum of American Art since her retirement this past April. As a member of the senior management team, she had overall responsibility for the museum's permanent collection and exhibitions. With a concentration in the primary fields of 19th and 20th century American art, she holds master's degrees in both art history and museum studies from Syracuse University, and has a record of published research in American and regional art. Laurence Glascoe is an associate professor in the history department of the University of Pittsburgh. Since coming to Pitt in 1969, he has focused on African American history, both locally and globally, and has studied the history of Black Pittsburgh for the past decade. He has researched and studied slavery in early Pittsburgh, and I believe it's a movie, is that correct? Slavery at Last?
Free at Last. Free
at Last, sorry.
Yes.
Well, that's a good error. Free at Last, which is available online. Among Dr. Glascoe's many publications on the history of Black Pittsburgh are the 1940s, Best of Times, August Wilson, Pittsburgh Places in His Life and Plays, and Teenie Harris, a biography. Special thanks to Audrey Lazar and her late husband, Bob, for their gift of the watermelon market to our congregation. And to Bob Myers and his late wife, Ruth, for lending us pieces by Rosenberg from their collection. And newly added this evening was a piece from Sally and Tim Littman of Tim's dad. So thanks to all of you for making this a full, complete exhibit. Now, just a few housekeeping details. Should we need to leave the hall, there are exits on either side, and if you proceed backward toward the in the hallway, there are doors that will lead outside. And, oh, by the way, please silence your phones. Thank you very much. And everybody's hand goes in their pocket.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
I know, I just did mine too, but she's carrying mine. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight, and I really appreciate being able to talk about Sam Rosenberg again. I'm revisiting a topic that I haven't really talked about in a very long time, the exhibition and of course, shameless PR of the book, which many of you brought with you tonight, was in 2003 already, 19 years ago, this book was published. So still proud of it, still learning things about Sam. So I hope you'll enjoy the images that I have to show you tonight. Rosenberg's painting and teaching career in Pittsburgh spanned nearly 6 decades. He was given many flattering titles over the years that he was here, Painter Laureate, Dean of Pittsburgh Painters, and a human sort of artist. And I thought that really sort of covers what we're going to be talking about tonight. His friends, his colleagues, his patrons, everybody who knew him really, really liked him. But not only liked him, they loved him. And I've heard that from people already here tonight. Sam was continually trying to find his style throughout his career. He began painting portraits, and you have a wonderful portrait of Rabbi Lippman here in this Rodef Shalom collection. He turned to socially conscious subjects in the 1930s, which I'm going to show you tonight. Allegorical abstractions in the 1940s, his response really to World War II and the atrocities of the Holocaust. And finally, his own personal form of abstract expressionism, and you also have a painting through Eastern Windows that represents that period. So with the watermelon market that you have just been gifted from Audrey Lazar, it really gives you the full range of Sam's artistic style, with the exception of something from the 40s. So maybe that will come at another point. So during the 1930s, Sam was painting his American scene, and specifically that was the urban landscape of Pittsburgh's Hill District and Soho. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. We're really concentrating on the 1930s. These paintings of his reflect the socioeconomic conditions that existed during the Depression years in the Hill District. And Rosenberg left a visual record of what he saw when he was there. He was reacting to the world he was living in. He didn't satirize, although some will question that he did, make some of his figures look a bit like caricatures. He spent his formative years in the Hill District. He was there from 1912 to 1924, starting out on Dinwiddie Street. By the 1930s, he was no longer living there, but he wanted to go back. He returned to paint. He taught for many, many years at the Irene Kaufman Settlement and actually founded the art school there. As he said in 1935, "I'd like to leave a record of the things I've seen and felt in Pittsburgh." And he also said, "The Hill District is the spot I know best." And I sort of align him a little bit with Robert Henry, who was the leader of the Ashcan School of Painters in the early 20th century. He told artists and his students to give evidence of their experience where they lived and where they were. And I think that Sam's experiences in the community were similar to what Robert Henry was espousing. He believed, as Henry did, that, as Henry said, art should express the spirit of its time and the spirit of its people. So Sam documented Pittsburgh very much this way, the way that Henry did, John Sloan, George Bellows, George Lukes, and other members of the Ashcan School as they documented Philadelphia and New York. So I'm going to show you some work of Sam's from the 1930s in Pittsburgh. The first one is 2nd Avenue. It was also called Man-Made Desert. Is it possible to lower the lighting at all in here? We're going to try. That way you'll be able to see these pictures, because the palette of these pictures is somewhat somber, reflecting the times. Okay, so instead of showing a large group of people on the street, we're calling, he had this second title called Man-Made Desert. It was changed to 2nd Avenue. It is a depiction of 2nd Avenue, but we see two men walking alone on the street, and along this very sort of looming stone wall, behind which is a steel mill. And there's not a lot of smoke. They're not surrounded by smoke. And so really what it's saying is that the mill was not running at full capacity. And in 1932, when Sam made this painting, there were major layoffs happening in Pittsburgh and in the steel industry and the mills in general. So I think that he was, as I said, socially conscious, and he was really calling attention to the community as it existed. So the watermelon market, so I'm taking you chronologically through his paintings of the 30s. And so the watermelon market comes very early in this decade. And so I can understand that it is a bit controversial right now, and it can be a sensitive and sort of uncomfortable image, especially looking at it today with the 21st century eyes. Sam was, painting things that he experienced and felt, and I think that that's exactly what you're seeing here. These markets were everywhere in the Hill District: fruit, vegetable markets, vendors, carts. It was a vital, vital area during the 1930s and during the Depression era. I don't think that he was being derogatory in any way in creating this painting. And there's really nothing inherently racist about watermelons. Watermelons is a great fruit. It tastes good. It's a beautiful color. But it has become a symbol to denigrate African Americans, and it's been that way since emancipation. So with emancipation, after the Civil War, free blacks grew, ate, and sold watermelons. And in doing so, made the fruit a symbol of their freedom and their self-sufficiency. So white Southerners then were threatened by this freedom, and they responded by making this a negative symbol that was associated with free black Americans. So they perceived them as unclean, associating with the watermelon because eating watermelon is messy, lazy because watermelons are easy to grow, and childish because watermelons are sweet, colorful, and they don't have a lot of nutritional value. So those are the sort of attributes that that was sort of placed on the watermelon and free blacks after emancipation. Jim Crow laws, of course, furthered the negative attributes of the watermelon. And at one point, I learned that actually enslaved African Americans were allowed by some of their owners to grow their own watermelons and sell them to earn a living. So on the one hand, I think that this painting also celebrates because the Great Migration, when Southern blacks came to Pittsburgh in great numbers to work in the mills, may have been bringing their own culture with them, and a piece of that, and a piece of that memory, perhaps, that came with them. So I think this can also be looked at as a celebratory painting. But it was also a piece of Pittsburgh that was very prominent during the 1930s. So this is Logan Street, where many of the vendors were located. And you can see the market here on the corner. And then in this grouping, a fruit and vegetable market here on the upper left, and another one here. And then this one actually is a photograph of Blitz's Hebrew bookstore. But if you look down the street, there's another fruit and vegetable market, and these are watermelons here being sold. So it really, this area was very vital, and it was an area that Sam returned to over and over and over again for his subjects. And just to place him in context and to sort of look at him stylistically, I'm going to show you a number of his paintings that are of that same area. So near Heron Hill, of course, this was the Upper Hill. This is the reservoir that's up on Heron Hill and that feeds a lot of the water to the neighborhoods, including Squirrel Hill and Bloomfield and the Upper Hill. And so it's nearby, but you're really seeing, sort of a typical neighborhood in the hill, and the way the houses are all joined together. And, one woman, walking along the street, and I love that he's included the steps, because in so many areas in the hill there are these, there are over 700 of these steps in Pittsburgh. Now, God's Chillin', 1934. Most of these paintings that you're looking at today are in the collection of the Westmoreland Museum of American Art. I would have added many more. There's many more in the book, but they're in private hands, and so it's at the time this book was published, we worked from transparency, so there's not digital imagery of everything now. So God's Chillin' is a painting that Larry thinks, and I think too, is one that would be a lot more controversial than Watermelon Market. Because in this one, it really does seem that he is, almost caricaturing, the individuals in this evangelical group that's getting ready to march along Crawford Street in the Hill District. And they're probably members of, sorry about that, an African American, maybe Masonic Lodge or some other brotherhood that are leading this parade, and we've got all the bystanders along each side waiting for this parade to commence. So it's the neighborhood. It's something that Sam actually witnessed, which was what I found a lot of times with his work, that he was actually on the spot and saw it and did many sketches ahead of time in preparation for the painting. So in speaking of that, so this is eviction, and this is one that we know in January of the year that he was passing by this home in the Hill District, and he saw this couple being evicted, and he saw their possessions being taken out and put in the snow. And it really moved him enough so that he made a number of sketches of it, and I've got two to show you, and this really beautiful drawing, which reminds me of Mr. Littman's drawing of his father that he brought in tonight, because I think it's the same, it's done in the same medium of charcoal. But it's a beautifully sensitive painting. But then when you look at the preparatory Conte crayon drawing of the next year, before he actually finished the painting, you can see that he's really looking at the movement of these figures, and he's doing it in this very abstract style. And so he's really just trying to catch the movement of the individuals in that composition. So this was, again, you know, Sam calling attention to the situation during the Depression years in the Hill District, but then also making, I think, what it's turned out to be a very sensitive portrait of this couple and their family in the doorway. Autumn in Pittsburgh from 1936. This is, you know, typical time of year. Right now we're experiencing, you know, the cloudy skies and the wind, and the leaves are all falling off the trees. And this just came to the Westmoreland this year from the Hillman Foundation, and it was one that I always coveted from the exhibition, and they were gracious enough to give it to the museum. But it really represents daily life in Pittsburgh and in the Hill District. Sunday morning from 1937, this is Kirkpatrick Street. You're seeing members of this small little church, which actually is still there on Kirkpatrick Street, leaving a morning worship service. And it's very colorful and very celebratory, again, very positive. And you can see how he's, you know, sort of shining the light on the entire composition here. And one of the other things that I think it does is that it calls attention to the separation of the hill, which is here, and then the rest of, you know, Pittsburgh and the south side being joined by the Birmingham Bridge, which is, that is the Brady Street Bridge, which is now the Birmingham Bridge. Upper Soho is a painting in a private collection who is a good friend of the museum, and again, it's a neighborhood that you would readily see in Soho, which of course is adjacent to the hill. Now, of course, the lower hill is completely gone now, but it was still there when Rosenberg was painting. But I think this painting also not only is just a daily reminder of what life was like in the Hill District, but I think it portends things to come with this in the background, which I think is the beginning of Bigelow Boulevard, when they were starting to bring it down. And we have Sam painted Bigelow Boulevard under construction, which is now at the Heinz History Center. So it's, you know, so the paintings, I think, have a story on the front end, and then there's also a little bit of a backstory to them as well. This fruit market, I think, is really interesting, and I pair it with an actual image of a fruit market, which you can see on the corner, very similar to this fruit market. And I think this is really one where Sam was really emphasizing the haves and have-nots of the Depression years. We've got, you know, this very abundant fruit market here, with all sorts of fruits and vegetables available, and then right next to it is a group of men who are presumably homeless, warming themselves around a fire, and they are the people that can't afford to buy anything at this market. So, you know, he's literally here shining the light on this aspect of the Depression.
Okay.
You're up, Larry.
All right. Thank you. Can you hear me? I don't have a... Okay, I have it. All right. Good. Well, I'm glad to be here. Rodef Shalom once again. I was here, my wife and I were here a number of years ago. Very good memories of that visit. And I'm also happy to be able to talk about Samuel Rosenberg and about the Hill District. I've spent a good part of my life now researching the Hill District. As was mentioned in the introduction, I also do world history. I tell my students I teach the history of Pittsburgh or the world. I don't mess with the unimportant stuff in between. But really, in some ways, Pittsburgh is the world. There is so much here. The city has such a rich history of the people, of the industry, of the great artists and musicians who've come out of here. There really is so much that it's very easy to spend your life studying a place like Pittsburgh, as well as, on the other hand, studying the world. I wanted to make a few comments on the painting of that we're featuring this evening.
Can we go back, Larry? Can we bring it back?
Yeah, maybe just show that again. Called the title is The Watermelon Market, of how the watermelon, and Barbara very nicely explained that, how the racists in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, for some reason, used the watermelon as a way to caricature black life, culture, practices, eating patterns, and the like. They were so successful that watermelon became something that people were embarrassed to eat. Some people were. It was kind of like with fried chicken. A lot of blacks wouldn't eat fried chicken, or if they did, they'd smile sort of knowingly, a little embarrassed, because that was another item that got caricatured in our racial past. My point in terms of watermelon and its position in black life, and whether it is something to be avoided or not talked about, really says that life has changed. That by the 1960s, as blacks were really looking for their racial identity, something like the watermelon came back into favor. This was something that we always ate, something we enjoyed, and something we can celebrate. And that's what this next, I have a thing, Herbie Hancock, in 1962, the great jazz pianist, composed a song very popular in the 60s.
What can I write
Watermelon Man.
Honestly about?
And here he explains why he wrote that song. You get the idea that this is a celebration, really, of watermelon by one of the great jazz pianists of all time. It was an extremely popular song, and probably a lot of you have heard that song. It was very popular in the 1960s, 70s, and it's become a standard in jazz. Something like that is really testimony to the way in which watermelon is no longer something that blacks are ashamed of, afraid of, avoiding. The racists moved beyond that. That racists may want to make the watermelon something shameful to eat. But Hancock and others have shown it can also be transformed into something that's beautiful, that makes you want to get up and dance and to celebrate. And I think that says a lot about the importance of that. Oh, okay. So that was just one of a preliminary remark I wanted to make in terms of watermelon. The other thing, in terms of the painting and the whole series of paintings by Samuel Rosenberg, what to me is so special is that he was someone who really went out and painted what he saw. We have so little of that. He really tried to capture the mood, the feeling, the sights, the sounds of that era. And it so nicely sort of speaks to us. We can, or the figures in there almost speak to us in ways that we can understand. The question is whether one can have a painting by by Rosenberg on that theme still of watermelon without the possibility of having this video of Herbie Hancock playing the song, or without having the text there that would sort of explain it. I just want to mention something about Pittsburgh Black history, which is this. There are really, in a way, two histories of Black Pittsburgh. This hasn't been really worked out. I'm still working it out in my head right now at home. But one part of that history I would call the Virginians. These were the original blacks who came to Pittsburgh, 19th century, and they were the dominant group up until about World War I. The Virginians came out of the Shenandoah Valley, Winchester area. They were slaves. Many of them came as runaway slaves to Pittsburgh. It's not that far. And they were very successful once they got here, which was really remarkable. I have quotes from the newspapers in Pittsburgh in 1841 talking about what a fine people they are. They build their houses with their own hands, picking up stones and erecting their homes. They go to church. They lead lives of great respectability. Their white neighbors are very happy to have them as neighbors because they are a real positive force in the community. Sorts of things that really you just don't read much about, examples like that in the press of the time. Well, these Virginians who had come up had been slaves, but they had been very different. They had a very different sort of experience from the typical slave experience. They did not work on plantations. They were not from the tobacco fields. The Shenandoah Valley is an area of mixed farming. They raise wheat, corn, oats, livestock, vegetables, and the like. Single-family farms in which the slaves and the owners worked side by side in the fields. It wasn't a hierarchical arrangement of owner, overseer, slave. This was families, black and white, working together. In such a setting, blacks became very assimilated to white culture because they were out isolated on these farms out in the country, and it was a black family and a white family. So there was a lot of interaction, a lot of interchange. I was going to say a lot of intermarriage, but they didn't marry. But 70% of black Pittsburghers in 1850, 70% of them were listed in the census as mulatto, meaning people of mixed race. So that was a sign that there was a lot of contact. There was a lot of interaction, socially, sexually, culturally. Culturally, blacks, these Virginians, came to Pittsburgh with a love of classical music. They had, between 1900 and 1920, they had something like 6 concert orchestras performing in the Hill District, performing European classical music. They had all sorts of string quartets. They had choir groups, basically singing not the blues, not gospel, but classical music. This was a very special group. They were the dominant group in Pittsburgh up until, let's say, World War I. World War I happened. This changed. Suddenly, America entered the war on the side of England against Germany. Germany responded by saying they were going to sink any ship they found crossing the Atlantic because they couldn't tell if the ship was transporting immigrant labor to America or transporting armaments from America back to Europe. The result was a sudden and complete cutoff of European immigration, which meant a sudden cutoff of European labor, because Pittsburgh's steel mills and the mills and factories and mines all over the country were basically, the labor force in those were European immigrants. This stopped suddenly in 1917. American manufacturers in the steel industry in Pittsburgh suddenly had a huge labor shortage. And so for the first time, they turned to black labor, Southern black labor, and they sent recruits down south and brought blacks up by the trainloads. Freedom tickets they gave them, free passage on the railroad. The result was what they call the Great Migration of blacks, not from Virginia, but from the plantation areas of the Deep South. In Pittsburgh, these were mainly from Alabama. Now, Alabamans then came to constitute the second chapter of black Pittsburgh history. They did not come up playing classical music. They did not come up with the sort of genteel orientation that the Virginians had. They came up with the sort of folk culture that Rosenberg is capturing there. And they were a very important and a large part of Pittsburgh society. So he's capturing a very important part of that society. But somehow we need a way of capturing the duality of that society as well, because I think this is where blacks get offended. There's so few opportunities for blacks to be presented to the larger world that each image counts. And a negative image or a caricatured image carries a lot more weight for blacks than it does for whites, because whites get to see themselves in a variety of settings. That's not so true of black Americans. And so, at dinner tonight, I was talking with the rabbi about the painting, the watermelon painting, and what to do with it in a public space like this. And I wrote a little essay for the evening, explaining sort of what I've been telling you, that watermelon, Herbie Hancock, all of this doesn't have the same resonance, the same meaning that it used to. Nonetheless, it might be, for people who aren't aware of this, it might be found to be offensive. My idea, this just came up this evening since this dinner conversation, would be we need some way in which we can also show the Virginian part of the story, the black middle class part of the story, of those who had other values, other lifestyles. Not to put down one and say this is what it should be or something like that, but just to give weight to both sides and say there was a spectrum of culture and cultural practices in the black community. And I was thinking what we might have would be a nice big photo by Teenie Harris. Because Teenie Harris was par excellence the portrayer of the black middle class. The people are looking good, they're dressed well, they're enjoying themselves, they're out for a good time. And I think having those two visual images side by side, this just came to me tonight, so I may in an hour have changed my mind, or you may change my mind this evening. But something perhaps like that would make the Rosenberg's paintings, put them in a broader context, and people could see the different sides of life. So I brought a picture, and this may not be the best picture. This is not a Teenie Harris picture. If I'd had this dinner conversation earlier, I'd have brought another picture. But here's one. This is of a group that represents this black middle class, black upper class. The other end of the spectrum is known as the Frogs. Kind of a strange name, but Frogs stands for friendly rivalry often generates success. Call themselves the Frogs. They go way back to the early part of the 20th century. They're part of this Virginian lifestyle and cultural preferences. And this is their headquarters. They still exist today. This is their headquarters. I took that picture probably about 20 years ago with one of the men. He'd been a student in my class who was a member of the Frogs. I can't think of his name, unfortunately. So go to the next slide there. This is a picture of the Frogs in 1913. This is before the Alabamans came in 1917. Now, one thing you notice, the color of the people in the picture. When I show this to my classes, there's a rush of, oh my God, really? But that was this Virginian group. It goes way back. Very light-skinned group, very proud of themselves, very interested in European culture and high culture, gentility, classical music, and the like. Now, the point is not to emphasize one group over the other, because the story of Black Pittsburgh is really the fusion of these two groups, of the melding of them. And that's what really made the story of Black Pittsburgh so exciting, because you have both ends operating. You have that classical end, you have the folk, you might call the folk culture end. And it explains why Pittsburgh was such a great jazz city, because jazz in a way is a blend of, let's say, African or Black folk blues sound with European marching band and classical music. And those two blended beautifully in Pittsburgh, to the extent that Pittsburgh, years ago I had a student in my class take the International Encyclopedia of Jazz, and I asked her simply to take down the number of people who were from Pittsburgh, who had been born or raised in Pittsburgh. And they did this for all the cities in this encyclopedia. Pittsburgh turned out to be the third per capita proportion of internationally known jazz greats. The only cities ahead of Pittsburgh in that were New Orleans and Memphis. So it was more than Chicago, more than New York, more than all these other places. And there's a reason for it, and I think it is that blending. I think a combination of, we wouldn't pick this picture, we get one a little more brown, because if you go back to that earlier picture of the gentleman who had shown me, the member of the frog, he is a brown-skinned gentleman. If you look at the frogs today, they don't look like the frogs of 1913. They're a brown-skinned group. Okay, so you would have both, and you would have, I think, a fuller representation of the Black experience in a way that the images might speak to one another. So that was just sort of my opening remarks. Now we'll get into we won't keep you here all night.
You ready for the next slide or not?
Yeah, give me the next slide. So I've talked about the Lewendijk. I've talked about the frogs. I could talk about the Lewendijk Club, which is a similar group, an elitist group. But this was the frogs in 1947. They had an international music festival of local Pittsburghers who had made it big nationally, came back for what's called Night of the Stars. Can you read the names of those people? I should have.
So,
Lois Depp, great female singer. Mary Lou Williams, great pianist. Billy Strayhorn, the man who wrote a lot of the music for Duke Ellington. Earl Father Hines. Maxine Sullivan. And Billy Eckstein. So it's an incredible panoply of famous jazz musicians who were from Pittsburgh, and the Frogs had them come back for a joint concert together. I mean, you can imagine what a reunion that was. So the story is that these two groups came together in ways that they physically meshed, the light skin, the dark skin, and getting a medium brown, let's say. But culturally, they meshed in terms of the music. They also meshed in terms of sports. You had the Black baseball teams of Pittsburgh were two of the best in all of the Negro leagues, the Homestead Grays, Pittsburgh Crawfords. Well, they had Pittsburgh boys playing on it. You had Josh Gibson from Georgia, and Georgia was the other state next to Alabama that had the largest number of migrants who came up in 1917, and Satchel Paige from Alabama. So there you had it right there as another example of the blending, the creative and positive blending of these two groups. And I suspect one could do a whole series of these sorts of cultural and social blendings around an exhibition of the Rosenberg painting of the market, and a Teenie Harris image of maybe those baseball teams or the clubs or something like that. So I've got a whole bunch of things I could have read, but I thought this all came out in the dinner conversation tonight, changed around my talk. I was thinking how to reorient it and maybe come up with some ideas that might work. In which case, I think it would be helpful if we had some conversation.
Do you want to, or do you want your last slide, which is?
Yeah, give me what's my last? Oh, well, this this is Mongo Santa Maria. This is his album of it. He put the fuller lyrics to that song and made the song even more popular, and that's the cover for his album. So it's the same idea as the.
So we will open it to questions then with the audience. I'll give you that.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we all learned tonight. So thank you. The reason I'm going to moderate is to greet our people who are online and say thanks to all of you for joining us through the Zoom link. It makes it a little more clear if I repeat the questions into the microphone. So I think I saw a hand over here. Excuse me. Just tell me your question. Okay. I'll say it.
How did the Crawford Grill and the Low End die? And how did that wonderful music, and people were always going to the Crawford Grill, the Low End, for the music, and then it stopped.
Okay, I'm going to repeat this, and you'll see if I have it correctly. How did the Crawford Grill end, and how did the vivaciousness of the Lower Hill end?
Yeah. Well, there are many reasons why the bright lights of the 30s and 40s and 50s dimmed in later decades. One had to do with the urban renewal of the hill, of course, where so much of the lower hill was torn down. So a lot was lost there in terms of landmarks. In terms of the Crawford Grill, it was a remarkable place. Over half of the audience at the Crawford Grill was white. Yes, it had large, it was popular across all sorts of neighborhoods. People came from out of town, white, black. It was a very congenial place for gathering. The best I can find is that it was television. People stopped going out in the 50s as television came in. They could stay home, get entertained, free. You had a cover charge at the Crawford Grill and at the Hurricane. And people just started staying home. You can find it in the Courier complaints being lodged by the owners of clubs that the fans just aren't coming out anymore. They're staying home watching television. Also, you had the spread of the automobile. People started living further away. In the old days, they could walk. A lot of people could walk to the clubs or take the trolley to the clubs. But once they're further away, they're going to get there with an automobile. Then there's the issue of parking. And there was no parking, or there was very little parking around the Crawford Grill. So people hesitated or didn't want to go out and maybe not find a parking place or not find one close enough.
So the building of the Civic Arena changed the whole...
Oh, absolutely. The urban renewal and the civic arena. It transplanted a lot of people out of the Hill. The Hill did not have the same numbers. Just the numbers went down from that urban renewal. That alone made a big difference. So the numbers, the location, compactness. You had a very compact. The Hill was a very crowded spot. I've heard geographers say it was similar to Bangladesh today in terms of the intensity of living. People lived in alleys and side streets and all sorts of places. So there were a lot of people to draw upon. So I think all of those operated. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
On the Hill, because there are a lot of Jewish people who came and worked and they helped. Did they ever coexist, live together, or whatever with the blacks?
So the question is, how did the blacks and Jews on the Hill coexist?
Yes, I would say, and my friend Barbara Burston is here, we taught a course at the University of Pittsburgh called Blacks and Jews. And one of the really exciting parts of the course was the degree to which blacks and Jews in Pittsburgh got along. There was really all the races and nationalities in the Hill District got along. I have gone through the Courier, which was always on the lookout for any sort of, bad stuff going on, just looking for race riot or racial violence. I could find almost nothing. I looked specifically for blacks and Jews, and I found one example, and it was called Race Riot. It was about blacks and Jews, and it turned out that there was a Jewish pool hall. A black guy went by and said something that didn't go over well. So the Jews came out and hit the guy with the pool sticks. So he went home and got his buddies who came down that night, and they all had a big fight. But that was the end of it. So the guys had a fight, and then they went home. It wasn't a riot. It was just a good old-fashioned fight. And the fights didn't go on. There weren't a succession of such fights. It didn't go anyplace. So the Hill District was really quite unusual in that regard. I think one of the reasons for it was an interracial and multi-ethnic place almost from the very beginning. Blacks always lived in the Hill. They were there from the founding of the city. And so they lived interspersed with whites. Remember I said how the whites appreciated them, they got along. They had these positive comments in the paper. And so when you got black migration, it wasn't like people were saying, oh, they're invading my territory. It was just a thickening and an increasing density of what was already there. So it didn't have this turf aspect, which in most cities, Chicago is notorious for this, but other places of neighborhood boundaries of you can't come into my territory. Well, the Hill was always everybody's territory, residentially and in terms of visitors coming in. People came from all over the city to those nightclubs in the Hill. And from my course, I teach this course on history of Black Pittsburgh. And one thing I always do is have a walking tour of the Hill District. And students are sometimes a little leery of it. They've been there and they have all these preconceived ideas and things. And one thing, almost without fail, I've done this for about 15 years, is they're surprised at how friendly people are and welcoming. They said you go into other neighborhoods, and if you're not from that, it's like people will sort of look at you like, not necessarily in a hostile way, but why are you here? What's up? Sort of thing. Whereas in the Hill, we're just used to having people here all the time, and you're welcome, and everybody's sort of welcome. So it really made for a different sort of atmosphere. I don't know, my colleague Barbara Burston, do you have any?
The Irene Cochran settlement was a huge...
Yeah?
The Irene Kaufman settlement was a huge venue where blacks and Jews were together.
Absolutely.
That's not to say that there wasn't discrimination. Blacks could not be members, but they could participate. And it was a big deal. It was a very big deal at that time. And when the Irene Kaufman settlement was, when the Jews moved out of the neighborhood, the Irene Kaufman settlement was sold to the Hill House, the black community, for $1.
Yeah. So that speaks well.
You had
Was selling paintings the main source of Rosenberg's livelihood?
We're,
Did he have any other type of production?
we're selling paintings, the only type of Mr. Rosenberg's livelihood.
Yeah. Barbara?
Sorry.
Yes, so he taught all the while he was painting. So he taught for 6 decades. He started at the Irene Kaufman settlement, taught at the Y. He taught adult classes, he taught kids classes, and then he taught at Carnegie Tech. And so he taught painting and drawing. And he is one of the professors that is the sort of anecdotal story that kept Andy Warhol at Carnegie Tech when he was going to be expelled. So Sam really supported him for his sort of independence, because he was very independent art student. But yeah, that's how Sam made his living. He sold a lot of paintings in his lifetime. He showed around the country. He just never, he could have probably succeeded if he'd gone to New York and been much more successful as an artist, but he chose purposely not to. He was represented by a gallery in New York, but he always remained in Pittsburgh. But he traveled around the world, so.
Mm-hmm. And Barbara mentioned the role of the Irene Kaufman Settlement House. I will say I'm doing a biography of August Wilson. And his first venture into theater was called Black Horizons Theater. And they did the planning for that at the Irene Kaufman Settlement, not in the main building, but in one of they had sort of satellite places in various parts of the Hill. And one of the places up there near where the library is today, they had an outreach center, and that's where they spent their summer planning the establishment of Black Horizons Theater with the support of the Irene Kaufman Settlement workers.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your enthusiasm and for joining us. Special thanks to our wonderful guests, our speakers, Barbara Jones and Dr. Larry Glascoe. We hope that you'll join us for dessert afterward. And thanks to both.
Okay, thank you.